Charles Dickens, Part 2. The best way to understand Charles Dickens is to learn to know him first when he was a boy. Odd though it may sound, we can actually become acquainted with the boy Charles Dickens. David Copperfield, at least in the beginning of his story, is a close delineation of the writer's own boyhood. David Copperfield's feelings and many of the happenings of his youth are the feelings and the happenings which made Charles Dickens the boy and the man that he was. Human beings are so wonderfully and strangely made that no mortal, no matter how hard he tries, can ever draw a perfectly true or a perfectly just picture of anyone. Some qualities always escape analysis, and each person living now or whoever has lived remains himself only. Dickens drew a wonderful picture of himself in David Copperfield. This is one reason why we love David Copperfield and understand him so well. Yet, David Copperfield is not exactly Charles Dickens. We can scarcely believe for one thing that David ever could have written as well about Charles as Charles has written about David. When Dickens was a boy of 10, he was sent to work in a blacking warehouse by his father, who was at that time in a debtor's prison. People, when Dickens was a boy, were sometimes left in prison for a long time if they could not pay their debts. Years afterwards, Dickens wrote of the secret agony of his soul while he worked at covering blacking bottles and of how he longed for companions, boys of his own age. Indeed, so unhappy were his recollections that when he was grown up, he mentioned these years to one person only, John Forster, the friend who wrote his biography. To remember this part of his life always gave him great pain. Charles Dickens was born at Portsmouth, Hampshire, England on 17 February 1812. Life in the Dickens family was not settled or stable. They moved frequently and were always more or less uncertain as to the future. The father, as has been said, at one time was in debtor's prison, and the family, including Charles, became familiar with the strange life of the Marshalsea, which is described with exactitude in more than one of Dickens' novels, but especially in Little Dorrit. At other times, and even in the Marshalsea, life for Dickens' family was interesting, even exciting. Charles was unhappy because of the work to which he was put and because he saw clearly, although he was only a little fellow, that he was losing the chance of obtaining an education. He was, however, an extraordinary observant and read with passionate absorption all the books that he could find. Pictures of the strange people he met and of the queer things they did remained with him throughout his life, and from this material gathered in his youth, he fashioned his great novels. He had dreams of what he would be and of what he would do. The family lived for a number of years in Chatham, his father being a clerk in the Navy Pay Office at the dockyard, and he used to see when he was walking with his father in the neighboring country a house called Gateshill Place. He planned then that someday he would own that house. It was in 1856 that he became the owner of Gateshill House when he was 44 years old, a considerable achievement for the boy of 10 who had washed and recovered blacking bottles. All his life, these youthful days were lived over again in his stories and in his own memory to a not inconsiderable extent. They influence us too because of the novels which Dickens wrote. The roads of Kent, where he went walking when they lived in Chatham, are the great roads of his novels. The characters he wrote about were created from traits and habits which he had observed in people. The unjust laws and cruel customs against which he fought so powerful a battle were those whose victims had excited his pity long before he had grown up. When the family fortunes were brighter, Charles Dickens went to school again for a couple of years. But from the time he was 15, he earned his own living. He began as a clerk or office boy. Later, he studied shorthand and entered the reporters' gallery of the House of Commons when he was 19. He began to write articles and sketches soon afterwards. His first book, Sketches by Boge, was published when he was 24. In the same year, he married Catherine Hogarth, the eldest daughter of George Hogarth, a fellow writer on the Morning Chronicle, who had been kind to him. From this year, 1936, until his death in 1870, he wrote a series of novels and stories with extraordinary speed and diligence. He traveled much but never ceased writing. He gave many public readings from his own works. He visited the United States and Canada in 1842 and in 1867-68 gave readings in the eastern cities of the United States. Wherever he went, he was received with acclaim and he was at all times an object of public attention. His gifts were great, but no one who follows the story of his life can help being struck by his extraordinary capacity for hard work. All his life, he labored more assiduously than any ordinary person can work, and when he stopped writing with one of his novels unfinished, he was, as far as we can tell, still in the enjoyment of almost undiminished powers as a writer. Dickens had been a sickly boy, often ill and suffering. As soon as he could be put to stand on a chair, so young was he had given childish recitations and sung childish songs for the entertainment of his father's and mother's friends. He was, in effect, as a child, somewhat spoiled by too much attention. Throughout his mature life, he lived at white heat. Ordinary, quiet days had no attraction for him. Dickens was oversensitive and somewhat quarrelsome. These are, perhaps, the only faults, certainly the main faults in his character. It can be said with justice, however, that he was continually under strain and pressure from overwork. He was, as well, excitable by temperament. One of the best brief descriptions of Dickens' appearance is by Leigh Hunt. What a face is his to meet in a drawing room. It has the life and soul in it of 50 human beings. He lived with an intensity which it is scarcely possible for less intense people to understand. When he finished David Copperfield, his life had been so absorbed in its characters that he wrote, I seem to be sending some part of myself into the shadowy world. A Christmas Carol, it seems to me a national benefit. Dickens was generous in his praise of the work of other writers and deeply grateful for any kindness shown himself, no matter how slight the benefit was. His married life was not altogether happy. His daughters, Mary and Kate, having taken pains to teach him the steps of the polka so that he might dance it at their brother's birthday party, Dickens, waking in the middle of the night before the party, was afraid that he had forgotten the proper steps and immediately got up out of bed to practice them. Two of his characters, Wilkins Micawber and Mr. Dorrit, are drawn, to some extent at least, from the character of his father. Mrs. Nickleby is said to be a portrait of his mother. It can at least be considered that Mr. Micawber and Mrs. Nickleby are among the greatest characters ever created by Dickens. He was attached to his father and mother and took pleasure in providing for their older years. He bought them a house a mile from the town of Exeter and looked after the furnishing of the house himself. His feeling for his children was deeply rooted in his heart. It expressed itself in a number of ways, never more plainly than in a letter to his youngest son written on the eve of the boy's leaving to join his brother in Australia. Dickens' popularity can hardly be overestimated. There is a story that while Dombey and Son was being published in monthly parts, a man who kept a snuff shop in London and had as well a number of lodgers read aloud the month's installment on the first Monday of every month at tea. Only those who paid for the tea shared in it, but all the lodgers could listen to the story. The incident affords a striking picture of the power Dickens had over all kinds of people. In his reminiscences by one of Dickens' sons, tell of how, when he was walking once with his father along the broad walk at the Jew in London, they met a little girl running ahead of her father and mother. When she saw who it was, she ran back crying, Oh, mummy, mummy, it is Charles Dickens. Dickens was greatly pleased. A well known statesman who lived in Queen Victoria's youth once said at a private dinner at which Dickens was present, Nothing is ever so good as it is thought. Dickens at once answered him, and nothing is so bad. We remember that few opportunities came to him. His great career was the result of his own exertions. There was no one at all to help him when he was young. We think with pride and admiration of his great achievements, and we love him for his affectionate nature and goodness of heart. No one can read Dickens' novels without learning what his character was: ardent, generous, and loving. He was a great novelist and a great benefactor. Thank you very much. Dickens, from his childhood, seems to have had a strong desire to leave the world a better place for other people than he had found it for himself. We can trace this feeling in his youth and through his manhood. It runs in his novels like a great tide of impulse and energy. These things should not happen, he seems to cry to the world. Come, let us unite against injustice and heartlessness in public and private dealing, against public and private wrong of every description. Let us banish bad customs from the earth so that it may be a fairer, brighter, happier place. One of his novels, A Tale of Two Cities, is a story of the French Revolution. The story shows that, in common with the rest of the world then living, Dickens' outlook on life had been powerfully affected by the French Revolution, as our world today has been vastly changed by the Great World War. The watchwords of the French Revolution were liberty, fraternity, equality. They rang like bells to waken all men's hearts against injustice. Their echoes are ringing still. During the revolution, which began in 1789, a little more than 20 years before Dickens was born, and in the years following the revolution, there were terrible excesses of cruelty, murder, and bloodshed by the revolutionists. But the spirit of revolt against wrong was in men's minds everywhere. In every country, change and revolution were impending, either violent change and revolution with bloodshed, or silent change and peaceful revolution. In Great Britain, it appears reasonably certain that the works of Charles Dickens had much to do with preventing a violent revolution. Well to do people read these books and their minds became more kindly to their fellow men. They were eager to help the poor and oppressed. The poor and unfortunate read Dickens' stories and were filled with the spirit of brotherhood to everyone, to the rich as well as to those who were poor as they themselves were poor. Dickens showed not that the poor were unhappy, but that they were unjustly and harshly treated. The living spirit of happiness and of Christmas is found in the house of the Cratchits. The Cratchits are poor, but they are wonderfully happy. People in many other countries, as well as England, rushed to help the poor people because of the happenings of the Cratchit family. You will read in A Christmas Carol. Tiny Tim and his crutch touched the heart of the world, and the heart of the world was made the better for it. We still are made better by the story of Cratchits. Above all, Dickens' novels overflow not only with tenderness and indignation against wrong and cruelty, but with abounding good temper and inexhaustible mirth. It has been said that danger of a violent revolution in Great Britain was swept away by the gales of good-tempered and hearty laughter which seized upon thousands of people who were reading these great stories. It was a splendid achievement for any novelist or for any man or woman. Dickens is generally given credit for having secured for the world a number of much needed reforms. Thank you very much.